Into the Lion's Den, a Reverend Margot Quade cozy mystery novella, Book 1. Written by S.E. Biglow. Narrated by Stephanie Dillard. Chapter 1. Homecoming was bittersweet. After 14 months serving her country, Margot Quade set foot back in the small town of Port Marie, Vermont, in the dead of winter. At present, she sat in the front seat of her car, a beat-up Honda, staring at the imposing structure that was the Nesbit home. With a large circular driveway and a columned front porch, it screamed wealth. Margot was never much for such obvious signs of money, but she'd accepted the dinner invitation from Derek Nesbit as a chance to catch up with a former brother-in-arms. The heater blasted stale air into Margot's face, making the strands of her blonde bob flutter under her nose and into her mouth. Time to brave the elements and the gaudy exterior, meet her friends' relatives. It was just dinner. Snow fell outside her window in thick flakes as she donned a hat. After climbing out of the car, she raced up the driveway, careful of her footing. It wouldn't make a very good first impression if she fell before even making it to the door. Ducking under the relative safety of the porch roof, she knocked on the front door. No response. Shivering in the bitter cold, she tugged off her glove and dug around in her coat pocket for her phone. Maybe I got the date or time wrong? The excessive heat of the Middle East threw off her New Englander sensibilities. Her exposed fingers turned red in a matter of seconds. She flipped to her calendar and found that she had not gotten the date or time wrong. Something seemed off. She knocked again. She was about to peer through one of the fogged-over front windows when the door squeaked on its hinges and opened inward. An older Latina woman with graying temples studied Margot in silence. Margot tucked her ungloved hand under her arm to keep it warm as the woman continued to eye her. "Hi, I'm Margot. Derek invited me for dinner." The woman smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. They remained pinched at the corners with worry. "Please come in," she responded in lightly accented English. Margot darted into the large front hall, grateful for the heat. She shed her coat, hat, and remaining glove. The woman dutifully took them, hanging them on a coat rack next to an old-school radiator. "Everyone is in the dining room," the woman said, and gestured for Margot to follow her. Margot stopped in front of the large staircase that dominated the rest of the entryway. At the end of each balustrade sat a lifelike, full-sized lion and lioness. She stepped closer and shivered, not from the cold, but from the dead look in the animals' eyes. She suspected they had once been alive. As she left the animals to guard their posts, she doubted she would get along with Derek's aunt and uncle. "Warren, that's unnecessary," a female voice said from a distance. "Just drop it," Derek's voice echoed from deeper in the house. The volume of his voice drew Margot with faster steps through an industrial kitchen to the large dining room. The table could easily seat 20, perhaps 30 people. Only 5 places were set at the far end. 4 of the chairs were presently occupied. Derek was on his feet, leaning over a man with snowy white hair. The woman beside him bore a striking resemblance to the older woman who'd invited Margot into the house, with cinnamon-colored skin and jet-black hair pulled into a loose braid, draped over one shoulder. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Margot said, making her presence known. Movement in the room stopped, and Derek turned at the sound of her voice. Their eyes met, and she noticed the fat lip and the bruise under his right eye. Despite his injuries, he stood at attention, hands behind his back. Even though his family was wealthy, Derek had exhibited none of the airs she'd expected. He was polite and kind, ready to help a fellow soldier, no matter the task. He was often the first awake in the morning for cleaning duties, even when it wasn't his assignment. Perhaps that was why they had hit it off so well. "Ma'am," he said, out of training and habit. Margot tried to give a kind smile. She understood that the formalities drilled into them in the army were hard to break, and even as a chaplain, she'd outranked him. It's just Margot these days. Derek took longer to relax from his position than Margot thought was really necessary. The young woman at his side got to her feet and offered Margot her hand. "I'm Catalina, Derek's wife, and that's my mother, Rosalinda." Derek hadn't stopped talking about his fiancée, Kat, while he and Margot had been completing their deployment. He'd been so excited to marry her. She hadn't made the connection, though, that Catalina was the daughter of his family's housekeeper. "It's nice to meet you. Derek talked about you all the time." Catalina smiled and let out a soft giggle. "Only good things, I hope." "Always. I'm sorry I missed the big day," Margot replied. Neither Derek nor Catalina responded to her statement. Mrs. Nesbit stood and rounded the end of the dining table to greet Margot. "Leave it to my nephew to not introduce us to his guest. I'm Mary Ellen Nesbit, and this is my husband, Warren. You can call me Mary." Warren Nesbit, upon closer inspection, was far heavier set than Margot would have imagined. From the stories she'd heard as a child, he'd always been an imposing man in great health. He looked more like an ordinary man in his 60s, having fallen victim to the ravages of time and aging. Margot Quade. Mary arched a brow in her nephew's direction. "So this is the Reverend you've been talking about for months at church?" Margot blushed. He really shouldn't have. Serving as a chaplain had given her a purpose, one fostered from growing up in the church. That same church now sat leaderless after her mentor, Reverend Patrick Hawley, retired over a year earlier. Coming home, she wasn't sure where she fit. "There's no one better for the position, and you know it," Derek argued. Derek believed Margot was perfect to take over leading the Christian portion of the new interfaith church, a sentiment Reverend Hawley shared. Margot didn't object to leading a congregation if it turned out to be God's path for her. "Derek mentioned you helped to keep up morale overseas," Mary said. Margot couldn't deny she and Derek had bonded during their time abroad. She regretted that the difference in their upbringing, Mary and Warren raised Derek on the wealthier side of town, meant they'd only connected as adults. "Enough of this religious talk. It's time to eat," Warren barked, not moving from his chair. Rosalinda, eyes cast downward, disappeared into the kitchen and carried out plates of roasted winter squash and carrots. Next came perfectly formed dinner rolls and a platter of white fish. Last, she brought out a bottle of red wine, setting it by Warren's place. "Aren't you joining us?" Margot asked, as Rosalinda beat a hasty exit out of the room. "The help doesn't eat with us," Warren answered abruptly, as he struggled to free the cork from the wine bottle. Margot bristled at his words. She couldn't fathom how Derek had grown up under this man's guidance and turned out so differently. She sat beside Catalina and leaned close. She whispered, "Is he always like this?" "Since Derek came back." Decorum dictated that Margot accept the food offered by her hosts, but she barely ate anything, the tension in the room too uncomfortable for her liking. Something was wrong in this house. "So, did you seek combat like Derek?" Mary asked, as Rosalinda carried out a carafe of coffee. "Aunt Mary, you can't ask things like that," Derek said quickly. "Well, you haven't told us much about what she actually did, or what you did, for that matter." "Careful, Mary. You'll trigger his post-traumatic stress," Warren snickered. Derek's fists tightened around the coffee cup in front of him. Margot had seen the telltale signs before, and not just in her fellow soldiers. She'd woken up in cold sweats in the middle of the night since her return home, swearing she'd heard a noise that could have been a bomb. She understood why Derek had been slim on the details of his service. There were some things one didn't share with civilians, and others that civilians couldn't understand without being there in the moment. "I didn't see much combat, no, but I saw the aftermath," Margot said in a measured tone. Just enough to give a response, but not enough to divulge their shared history. "Well, Derek mentioned you saved his life. Thank you. Thank you for getting my husband back to me safely," Catalina said with a sincere look. "It wasn't just me, but you're welcome." Without warning or ceremony, Warren stood, unsteady on his feet, and teetered out of the room. The moment he was out of earshot and sight, the remaining Nesbits relaxed. Mary disappeared into the kitchen, returning with Rosalinda behind her, carrying a dinner plate. She sat beside her daughter and ate in silence. "I'm very sorry you had to see my husband like that," she said to Margot. "He's turned into such a prick," Derek said. "He didn't used to be like this," Mary said, as if her nephew hadn't spoken. "I think Derek going away overseas took a toll on him." He wouldn't be the first family member to exhibit strain from a soldier's absence. I know that feeling. War can be difficult on families. Did he ever serve? "Uncle Warren?" Derek scoffed and rolled his eyes. "Yeah, right. He never worked a day in his life. I know I didn't act like it, but our family money goes back a long way. Everything you see here, he inherited." Derek stood up, breathing heavily, before storming out of the room. Margot watched him go in shock. Catalina gave Margot a brief apologetic look and then followed her husband. They left Margot alone with Rosalinda and Mary. Mary studied the contents of her coffee cup in silence, refusing to acknowledge Derek's tirade. Their attitudes and behavior made Margot wonder whether they had actually been to church of late. Perhaps they needed to be around people who shared their beliefs. "He wasn't happy about their wedding," Rosalinda muttered, so softly Margot almost missed it altogether. "Why not?" Margot asked. Mary spoke up. "Warren thought they should have a traditional church wedding. It's what we had, and since we had no children of our own, he never had the opportunity to host it. He felt cheated." They went to the town hall, just the two of them. "No minister, witnesses, or anything," Rosalinda explained, her voice growing stronger. "Warren was furious," Mary added. The tension within the ranks made sense. From the little interaction she'd had with Warren, Margot could pin him as the type of man who wouldn't easily give up control of situations and people in his orbit. Having his nephew, someone he viewed like a son, marry in a manner he didn't approve of would make him upset. "That's not the only reason he is angry," Rosalinda added, her voice softening again. "Why else would he be upset?" Margot probed. "He isn't happy that Derek married the daughter of the help." Margot believed Rosalinda's statement, given Warren's reference to the help. Perhaps this was a test to see if she could counsel this family through this troubling time. Maybe this was God's way of showing her she had a purpose in Port Marie. If Derek believed in her abilities enough to convince the congregation to call her their new minister, the least she could do was prove them right by helping him and his family in a time of stress. First, she wanted to talk to Warren and see if there was any truth to what everyone else had shared with her. "Would you excuse me for a moment?" Margot stood before anyone gave her permission and made her way out of the dining room in the direction Warren had disappeared. She found him sitting in a large wing-backed leather chair in front of a roaring fire. "Mr. Nesbit? Or would you rather Warren? It's Margot. I was hoping we could speak for a few minutes." Silence. She stepped around the side of his chair and something sticky caught at the bottom of her boot. She looked down to see an empty scotch glass lying on the hardwood floor. How had none of them heard it fall? And why wasn't Warren moving to pick it up? Instead, he sat unmoving and unseeing in the chair. With a sinking feeling, Margot pressed her fingers to the man's throat. No pulse. Warren Nesbit was dead. Chapter 2. Margot had some experience administering last rites to those who wouldn't make it home from the battlefield, but she had never happened upon a dead body before. Footsteps drew Margot's attention away from the man, and she looked up to see Derek standing in the room's doorway. "He's dead," she announced, the words sounding strange to her ears. "That's not funny." She shook her head. "I'm not kidding." Derek stalked over to the chair and bent down to study his uncle. "He was fine 20 minutes ago." "He's not now. We should call the police." Derek's eyes narrowed. "Why the police?" "They'd be the ones who can call a medical examiner. And if he was fine only half an hour ago, it's unlikely he died of natural causes. They'll want to investigate. Derek didn't look pleased by Margot's statement, but he pulled his cell phone from his pocket and dialed 911. He stepped back, away from his uncle's body, still close enough for Margot to hear the dispatcher on the other end of the line. 911, what is your emergency? This is Derek Nesbitt. My Uncle Warren is dead. You need to send someone, please. Margot didn't pay attention as Derek verified the street address. She bent over to study Warren's body in closer detail, careful not to touch anything else with her bare hands. There were odd flecks around his mouth, but they didn't mean anything to her. He wasn't this sweaty earlier, was he? Even with a fire burning in the hearth, his body shouldn't have taken on such a sheen. She also noted tiny pinpricks on his left index finger, and there was also a tiny hole in the thigh of his left pant leg. Up close, she spotted the raw skin on his knuckles from where he'd punched something. Or someone. Derek's injuries made sense now. I need to tell Aunt Mary, Derek said, pulling Margot from her investigation. Yes, that's a good idea. Derek, I'm so sorry for your loss. Margot reached out a hand to give her friend support, but he shied away. He left the room without a word. His heavy footfalls thudded on the wooden floor leading into the dining room. Margot retreated there as well and found it empty. She heard the clatter of dishes and the sound of running water in the kitchen, so she followed the cacophony to find Catalina and Rosalinda standing side by side at the sink doing dishes. Before she could speak, a loud knock on the front door drew her attention. Most likely the police. There were benefits to living in a small town. Rapid law enforcement response among them. Who is that? Catalina wondered aloud. Margot knew they needed to hear the news, but not from her. No matter how many stories Derek told them about her, she was still a stranger. So she darted back into the front hall, ignoring the imposing silhouettes of the lion and lioness on the balustrades, and pulled the heavy door open. Snow swirled outside, the storm having picked up since her arrival. There was little chance she could get her car out of this mess until the storm stopped raging. Sam? She said, surprised by the person standing on the other side of the threshold. Samantha Raymond had been only a year behind Margot in school. She also happened to be Margot's first cousin. What are you doing here? Sam questioned, her gaze narrowing. They hadn't spoken since Margot's return from active duty. Realizing it was rude to keep her cousin standing in the cold, Margot stepped back and allowed Sam to enter the warmth of the house. Sam stomped the snow from her boots and looked around. I didn't know you even knew the Nesbitts, Sam commented. Derek and I served together. Oh. Just as Margot gestured for Sam to follow her into the kitchen, a high-pitched wail echoed from deep within the house. 4 sets of footsteps thundered toward the sound, converging in the sitting room to find Mary draped over Warren's body, Derek standing off to one side. It seemed the gravity of the situation was finally settling over Derek, but he was responding in true military fashion. He'd been trained to hide his feelings at the loss of one of his own. He squared his shoulders, and a hardness had taken over his facial features. Anyone who didn't know what he was doing would assume he had something to hide. Oh my God, Catalina rasped at the sight of Warren's prone form in the chair. She raced to her husband's side and buried her face in his shoulder. He barely moved. Mrs. Nesbitt, you need to let go now, Sam said, her voice soft. Mary blinked through thick tears, confusion on her face. I don't understand. Why are you here? I called the police, Aunt Mary, Derek answered, his tone robotic. But why? Mary repeated. Sam let out a sigh. By your reaction, I take it this was a shock. Mary wiped tears away from her cheeks with the back of her hand. Of course it's a shock. My husband wouldn't just drop dead. Sam nodded. Which is why I'm here. I need to investigate what happened. She turned to look at Margot. Let's start with your statement and give the family some time to collect themselves. Chapter 3. Margot followed Sam back to the kitchen, where the sink's faucet was still running. Feeling uneasy, Margot busied herself with shutting it off and stacking the plates into the dishwasher. "How do you know the Nesbits?" Sam asked. "As I said before, Derek and I served together. We became friends, and when I came home, we reconnected. He invited me to have dinner with his family." Margot faced her cousin. They had been good friends growing up, and had remained so even after Margot followed God's calling and attended seminary. Sam had never been a spiritual person, but she'd believed in doing good and helping those who couldn't help themselves. Margot had thought Sam understood why she'd joined the military, to follow the path the Lord had set for her. While Margot was overseas, Sam had refused to email her back and wouldn't accept her calls. "I'm sorry," Margot said, feeling the awkward silence between them. "For what?" "For whatever I did to make you so upset with me." Sam heaved a sigh. "I'm not mad at you. I'm mad at myself." Margot moved to lean against the counter beside her cousin. "What do you have to be mad about?" "You made something of yourself. You ran into danger, and all I did was sit home in Port Marie." "Sam, come on. You put on a badge every day. At any time, you could walk right into danger's path." Sam snorted. "Let's be real. Nothing that dangerous ever happens in Port Marie." Margot gestured toward the dining room. "Well, at least you've got a mystery to solve. I might as well give you my statement." Sam nodded as she pulled out a notepad and pen. "Okay, tell me what you saw." Margot fingered the cross and dog tags at her throat. She'd worn them this way since she arrived in the Middle East. It comforted her. It also helped to center her thoughts. "I came for dinner, like I said. When I arrived, there was some argument going on." "Could you tell about what?" "No, but Derek and Warren were going at it. Derek had a bloody lip and a bruise under his eye. They looked fresh. I noticed some abrasions on Warren's knuckles when I found him." "So you were the first person to notice he'd died?" "Yes. He said some rather insensitive things during dinner. I don't think he's pleased with the fact that Derek and Catalina got married, or the way they went about it. He stormed out of dinner. I wanted to talk to him, to see if I could try and help smooth things over. That's when I went looking for him. I found him in the other room. It must have happened quickly." "What sort of things did he say during dinner?" Sam probed. Margot hesitated. It wasn't her place to share Warren's diatribe, and she felt bad enough already with what she'd said. She'd been taught not to speak ill of the dead. "He referred to Rosalinda, Catalina's mother, as the help. Catalina's mother mentioned he also seemed unhappy that Catalina and Derek went to town hall to get married." Sam scribbled notes on her pad and wet her lips. "I'd tell you not to leave town in case I have more questions, but you won't be able to get out of here anyway. The storm is only supposed to get progressively worse through the night." "I'm guessing I can't hitch a ride with you?" "Sorry, I wouldn't want to be accused of giving you preferential treatment just because we're family." She would be stuck in the Nesbit home for the foreseeable future with a potential killer. "If you'll excuse me, I need to see about getting a forensic team here. It could be difficult with the storm. Also, please let Derek know I need to talk to him next." Margot headed to the dining room when she stopped. "I know you think his reaction means he did something to his uncle, but he's doing what the military trained him to do, to compartmentalize his emotions. Just remember that, okay?" "Just tell him." Margot made the trek back to the library in what was becoming a familiar route. The women had left, and Derek stood in front of the fireplace. The flames had died down to embers. "What are they going to do with his body?" Derek asked. "Officer Raymond is calling in a forensic team to look at and move the body, but with the storm, it may take some time. She wants to talk to you next," Margot relayed. "You should stay." "I'm here for whatever you need, Derek. You know that." He shook his head. "I meant for the night. It's not safe to drive in this mess." "I appreciate the hospitality. Now, please go give her your statement." He took a few steps past his uncle's body and stopped. "It looks bad, doesn't it? That we fought." He wasn't wrong. Margot had sensed something amiss when she arrived. Still, Derek's not the type of person to commit murder. She'd seen him run into danger to save his fellow man. She couldn't believe he was capable of such an unthinkable act. He didn't need her suspicion right now. She placed a hand on his shoulder. He didn't shy away this time. "I know the truth will come out. Just be honest with her." Other questions swirled in the back of her mind. How long had Warren felt that way about Rosalinda and her daughter? How long had she been working for the Nesbits? Most people in town, even those with money, didn't have live-in housekeepers anymore. The unanswered questions nagged at Margot. She wasn't one to stick her nose where it didn't belong, but this whole situation unsettled her. She had every confidence in Sam's investigative abilities, but surely her cousin wouldn't mind some extra help. First, Margot needed to make sure her staying the night was okay with Mary. She wandered the first floor, glimpsing Sam and Derek in the kitchen, before she made her way up the winding staircase to the second floor. She turned right and walked down the hall. The doors proved to be concealing extra guest bedrooms and a bathroom. The last door on the left was a linen closet. She turned back to check the other end of the floor when Mary appeared. She'd stopped crying, but her skin was pale and her eyes were red-rimmed. Her eyes widened in surprise upon seeing Margot. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Nesbit. I didn't mean to startle you," Margot apologized, reverting to the formality a guest should show a host. Mary blinked a time or two before putting on a small smile. "I was just... Is the police officer still here?" "Yes. She's called for help with Warren's remains. She needs to speak with you. Rosalinda and Catalina, too. Just to take your statements." "But we don't know anything." She's trying to piece together his last few hours. Having as many perspectives as possible is useful. And I want you to know I'm here to help. Grief can be confusing and unpredictable. If you need help with his service, I'll do what I can. I know I'm not actually the minister, but I'm sure the Board of Deacons wouldn't mind me coordinating on your behalf." "That's kind of you. I'll think about it." She glanced out one of the nearby windows. "It's picking up out there. You shouldn't drive in this." "Derek already offered to let me stay the night. I hope that's not too intrusive." "Of course not. Come on, I'll make up a guest room for you." Margot caught sight of flashing lights through the thick, swirling storm. Perhaps they would get some answers sooner rather than later. "Mary, can I ask you something?" She met the older woman at the linen closet. "About what?" "I had a question about Warren's health of late." "His health? Had he been feeling all right?" "He was fine. I mean, he was diagnosed with diabetes last year, but he was managing it." "With insulin injections," Margot muttered. "How'd you know?" "It's a common treatment. It also explained the pinprick on his finger and the hole in his pants. He'd been checking his blood sugar and administering insulin shots." "Right. Forgive me. I'm distracted." "I understand." "Aunt Mary," Derek's voice boomed up from the bottom of the staircase, echoing oddly in the upstairs acoustics. "I suppose it's my turn, then," Mary murmured. Margot took the sheets and fresh towels from Mary's outstretched hands. "I can handle this. Thank you." "The room just there will be fine. It's next to Derek's." Mary waved a hand at one of the partially closed doors as she made her way down the stairs and out of view. Mary's comment struck Margot as strange. If Derek and Catalina had been married for a few months now, wouldn't they share a bedroom? When she stuck her head into the room Mary had denoted as her nephew's, no items of women's clothing or other feminine touches marked the space. Margot filed that away as another oddity in what was shaping up to be a perplexing mystery. Chapter 4. Margot took her time making up the guest bed. She wanted to consider the information she had so far and stay out of Sam's way. It wouldn't do to have her cousin angry with her after they'd finally reconnected. Who would have thought they would begin to repair their relationship over a dead body? Margot settled on the end of the bed, closed her eyes, and bowed her head. For her, prayer had never been about the words she said. She needed to be in a quiet place, at peace. Margot focused on her breathing, how each inhale and exhale felt in her chest. It had given her solace during the late nights and early mornings overseas. She had faith that whatever had befallen Warren Nesbit would be solved. She believed in her cousin's abilities and in the notion that good always triumphs evil. If someone in this house knew something, which was likely given that they had been living together for so long, they would bring it to Sam's attention. Still, questions swirled in Margot's mind. Where had Derek gone after he'd stormed out? Mary's behavior was strange, too. People grieved differently, but her reluctance to answer questions about Warren was suspicious. And Margot hadn't spoken with Rosalinda or Catalina in depth, but she suspected neither of them held high opinions of Warren, given his comments at dinner. Their reactions, or lack thereof, told Margot they were not new sentiments, and they'd heard those words, or worse, spoken before. "There you are." Sam's voice pulled Margot from her contemplation. "What's going on?" "I had some follow-up questions. I need you to come back downstairs." Margot pushed herself off the bed and followed without a word. They traipsed back down the spiral stairs, and Sam led her into the sitting room, where technicians were busy tending to the scene and Warren's body. Aside from the forensics team, the room appeared the same as it had when Margot first happened upon Warren. "What do you need to know?" Margot looked Sam in the eye. "First, the tech said they found a fingerprint on his neck. Did you or anyone else touch the body?" Margot's heart sank. She'd been foolish. "I did, to check for a pulse. I can give you prints to exclude me if that would help." "Probably for the best. Did you notice anything else unusual when you found him?" "Unusual how?" "Just anything that seemed off about his body?" Margot tried to recall what she'd noted when she was doing a cursory examination of the dead man. "I mean, I noticed the pinhole pricks in his pants and his index finger, but that's from testing his blood sugar and insulin injections for diabetes. At least, that's what Mary told me." Sam's brow furrowed. "She mentioned nothing about diabetes." "She's still in shock," Margot said, though she didn't really believe her own words. "What about the fire? Was it hot in here?" "I guess so. The fire was going." "Were there any other fires going in the house?" "Not that I noticed. In all honesty, until I came in here, I'd only been in the foyer, the kitchen, and the dining room." "We will run some tests, but I can't shake the feeling that something happened here. I don't think he keeled over of natural causes." Margot wanted to agree with Sam's assessment, but she wasn't ready to believe any of the family capable of such an act. "I'm sure you'll figure it out." "We'll be taking his body when they're done." "I'm staying the night." Margot didn't add that she'd keep an eye on everyone, but the understanding seemed to pass between the two women. Sam took one last look around the room and stowed her notepad. "I need to talk to everyone together. I think everyone is in the dining room." Margot traced the now familiar path back to the ornate dining room. As Sam had said, the 4 remaining occupants sat around the table looking glum. Derek poured a mostly empty bottle of whiskey into a glass, then tossed the contents back in one gulp. "We're taking the body now," Sam said. "Until we determine a cause of death, none of you should leave town. I may have follow-up questions." "Yes, of course," Catalina answered for the group. Despite the house not being hers, Margot escorted her cousin back to the foyer. Wind howled outside as they opened the front door. "I'm sorry I didn't write you or call while you were away," Sam whispered. "We've got all the time in the world to make up for it now," Margot replied, and pulled her cousin into a quick, one-armed hug. Sam donned her jacket and started out through the thigh-high drifts to her car. In short order, the forensics team trotted toward their van carrying Warren's body, shrouded in a bag. Margot shoved the door closed behind them, exhaustion from the evening's events hitting her. From the kitchen, she heard Derek's voice rising in pitch. "I can damn well drink if I want. I'm a grown man." He staggered into the foyer, refusing to meet Margot's gaze. He pulled himself up the stairs by the railing, Catalina hot on his heels. Rosalinda and Mary followed soon after, leaving Margot to bring up the rear. She shed her pants and blouse, leaving her in a long-sleeved undershirt, before crawling beneath the blankets. She hoped sleep would carry her away, and the whole tragic affair would make more sense in the light of day. Chapter 5. Cries woke Margot from a dead sleep. She sat straight up in bed, disoriented by the unfamiliar and darkened surroundings. She looked left and right before memories of the evening came back to her. The cries grew louder, and she couldn't ignore them any longer. She fumbled for her pants, tugging them on in haste. In the pitch-black darkness of the room, she was back in the Middle East. Her breathing grew short and ragged as she eased open the bedroom door. She bent low, pressing her body to the wall, her ears straining to pick up on the cries. She closed her eyes to allow her ears to be the stronger sense. The cries leapt out from her left, coming from the next bedroom. Derek's. She crept along the wall, easing the door open. There was just as little light in the room as had been in her own. She fumbled for a light switch, but thought better. She didn't need to blind them both. Instead, she waited, allowing her eyes to adjust to the dark. Finally, she could make out Derek's thrashing form in the bed. His arms flailed above his head. She moved along the plush carpeting to stand beside the bed. This close, she could make out the sheen of sweat on his brow. "No, get down," he moaned, his entire body tossing from side to side. "Abrams, wait!" Breath caught in Margot's throat. She knew the nightmare that had trapped him. During their tour of duty, rebels ambushed their convoy, and one of their fellow soldiers, Peter Abrams, had taken the brunt of the shrapnel. He hadn't made it home. Margot and Derek had stayed with him, holding tight to his hands as he passed away. "Soldier, wake up," Margot hissed, hoping her authoritative tone would draw him from the memory. Derek continued to whimper and toss and turn. Margot needed to take a more drastic action. She seized him by both shoulders and shook him. "Private Nesbitt, wake up!" He shot up, eyes wide and unfocused. His body tensed until he blinked, coming back to reality. Hair stuck to his forehead, and his hands shook as he turned to look at Margot. Confusion turned to shame. "It will be all right," she whispered, giving his shoulders a firm squeeze. He didn't speak until Margot turned on the lights, bathing them in a pale yellow glow. His skin was pale, almost ashen, and the bruise under his eye stood out even more. The split in his lip looked angry and raw. "You shouldn't have to see me like this," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Don't be ridiculous. You're going through a very difficult time. It's bound to bring up bad memories." "It should have been me driving." He stared down at his hands as they continued to shake. "You can't blame yourself for surviving. There is always a plan, even if we can't see it at the time. You had to survive to come home and marry the love of your life." "We haven't been able to share a room since I got back," he admitted. That explained the lack of a feminine touch in the room. She wanted to comfort him, to tell him that it would all get better, but she didn't want to mislead him. She wasn't a counselor, not in that sense. She couldn't give him the psychological help he needed. She doubted he had even sought treatment. "Have you told her why?" Margot asked. He shook his head. "She wouldn't understand." "Because she wasn't there. She didn't see how scared Peter was when he realized he wouldn't make it.
I still see the look in his eyes when he stopped breathing.
Margot understood. Some nights, she too couldn't shake the image of their friend dying in their arms. I think Catalina has more strength than you give her credit for. She married you, knowing you had seen combat. She's your support system now. You need to lean on her, to trust her.
I know, and I want to, but I'm scared. I haven't told anyone.
Including his uncle, who'd seemed so dismissive of his possible PTSD diagnosis. Is that why you were fighting with your uncle earlier? Because he didn't understand what you've been through and what you've lost?
No. I don't know what happened while we were deployed, but he was a different man when I came home. So angry and mean. You heard the things he said about Kat's mother. He never used to be like that. He was always kind. She was a Guatemalan immigrant. She was pregnant when they hired her. They let her live with us, and I grew up with Kat. I think that's why we fell in love. I couldn't imagine my life without her. But they paid Rosalinda more than most folks make in entry-level jobs. I mean, she wasn't making 6 figures or anything, but she could have moved out ages ago and gotten a decent place of her own. She stayed because we are her family. Until Uncle Warren started to treat her like she wasn't a person.
Margot let Derek's words sink in. The man Derek described as having raised him and taken in a woman who needed a job and a place to raise her child didn't jive with the one she'd met last night. It raised more questions about what had happened with him in Derek's absence. Was he diagnosed with diabetes before you deployed?
No, that happened after I left. As far as I knew, it was manageable, and he was doing fine. I don't get why he became so angry and hateful toward everyone.
It is a mystery, she agreed. One she committed to solving. She wouldn't be stepping on Sam's toes if she was simply trying to determine why a man who had been such a pillar of the community had turned into such a despicable person.
I'm okay now,
Derek said, wiping sweat from his face with the hem of his nightshirt. Are you sure? Why don't I get you a glass of water? After a moment of contemplation, Derek nodded.
Thanks.
Margot padded down the hall to the staircase, shivering at the imposing shadows of the lions as she passed. In the early morning darkness, they seemed poised to stalk her like prey, ready to pounce. Taking a deep breath, she made her way to the first floor, leaving the beasts behind. She was about to enter the kitchen when a clang caught her off guard. She stopped, listening to see if the sound repeated. When it didn't, she continued into the kitchen and searched for a light. She found the switch on the wall and flooded the space with fluorescent light. Rosalinda stood in the center of the kitchen, a startled expression on her face. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to surprise you. I was just getting a glass of water," Margot said. Rosalinda paused, her hands clutched to her chest for a moment before she relaxed. "I am sorry, too. With everything that's happened, I can't sleep. So sometimes I like to clean." Margot nodded and stood immobile. "Could you point me to the water glasses?" Rosalinda let out a small hiccup of nervous laughter and pointed to the cabinet to Margot's left, on the bottom shelf. Margot busied herself with filling the cup. Rosalinda disappeared past her and back upstairs. Margot took her time heading back up. Derek's nightmare about Peter's death dredged up her own memories of that particular loss. If she closed her eyes, she could still feel the sand digging into her palms as Peter clutched her hand, his blood making their fingers slick. Derek needed a brave face now, and she pushed the memory down. She kept her head down as she darted up the stairs. The tiny hairs on the nape of her neck bristled, and she turned to find the hallway empty. Despite the fact she was alone, her body refused to ignore the warning that she was being watched. "Get a grip," she chided herself, and returned to Derek's room to find him still sitting in bed. Thankfully, he looked a little less frazzled. She pushed the glass into his waiting hands. "Here, this should help."
Margot stood over him and watched as he drank the contents, ever the motherly figure. He set the empty glass on the nightstand and settled back beneath the blankets. "You don't have to stay and watch me sleep," he said with a half-smile. "Sorry, habits are hard to break," she answered, and left him to go back to her room. She was surprised the commotion hadn't woken the rest of the house. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of someone watching her. She glanced over her shoulder one last time before she returned to the guest room and shut the door. Chapter 6. Sunlight filtered through the gauzy blinds, falling across Margot's eyes. She moaned, throwing a hand over her face to block the light. Sounds of movement came from the hall. She sat up, smoothing what felt like bedhead. Her short bob was prone to stick up in all directions, before kicking off the blankets and making her way to the door. Catalina stood outside the doorway, her deep brown eyes wide and her lips pinched with worry. "What's wrong?" Margot asked. "Derek's missing." Margot stared, mouth agape at the other woman. "What?" "He's gone." Margot pushed past the other woman and marched down the hall. The door to Derek's room was ajar. The bedclothes were a wrinkled mess, shoved to one side. She peered out the window. At least the storm had stopped raging. She tried to find any sign that he'd simply gone outside to shovel, but the snowdrifts on the front lawn and driveway were undisturbed. "He was here a few hours ago," Margot muttered. "How do you know?" Catalina's tone carried a note of accusation. Margot realized the fact that she, and not his wife, knew of his late-night whereabouts appeared suspect. Catalina didn't think there was anything Margot and Derek might have shared during duty, did she? "He was having flashbacks in his sleep. Nightmares, really. I heard him and woke him up," Margot replied. Catalina's face fell, and she slunk into the room and perched on the foot of the bed. "He won't tell me what's been going on. Do you know what he doesn't want to talk about?" Margot sat beside her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "I do, but it's not my place to share it with you. He knows you're here for him. You need to be patient. The things he's seen and lost during his time overseas will take a lot of time to heal, if they ever do. And I hope you don't think there is anything besides friendship between him and me. All he could do was talk about you when we were abroad. He was so excited that you'd agreed to marry him when he got home." Catalina's shoulders relaxed a fraction. "Honestly, when he talked about you at church all the time, it worried me. He put you on a pedestal, like you could do no wrong and you were perfect. He said it so much, everyone believed it." "I'm far from perfect. I appreciate his support of my abilities, but I have to admit it surprised me to hear he'd been talking about me to everyone. I'm still unsure that's my place or purpose." "Even if you're only half as good as he says, I think the church would do well under your leadership. We need someone from our generation who understands what it means to be a 30-something these days. The issues we face are so very different from when our parents were our age." Margot blushed at Catalina's praise, such as it was. The more she heard from the people around her, the more she thought perhaps it was worth a try to see if the church was the right place for her to go on her spiritual journey. She had to believe that God was putting these circumstances in her path for a reason. "Come on, maybe Derek just went for a walk or something," Margot suggested, and stood up. After retrieving her blouse from the guest room, they walked side by side downstairs, and Margot allowed Catalina to lead her through to a different room, one that she'd not seen before. It looked like a library, the shelves piled high with carefully curated and preserved books. Some were leather-bound. She plucked one off the shelf in a section devoted to taxidermy and flipped to the front page. It was a first edition. Derek was nowhere to be found. Is there somewhere else in the house he would go? "I mean, there's space in the basement, but it's storage. We used to play hide and seek there when we were really little. Derek and I would hide for hours down there, pretending we were explorers. The things you think of as children." Catalina said with a sad smile. Can I ask you something? Margot pressed as they made their way toward the back of the house and down a set of cement steps. Sure. Did you notice when Warren's behavior and temperament changed? She had a suspicious feeling that Catalina would know the answer. The more information she could gather, the better chance she had of figuring out what had turned such a decent man into a monster. And maybe it could even help Sam find the responsible party if Warren had been murdered. While Derek was away. It started slowly at first, I guess, just sort of forgetful. Then he would get kind of grumpy and yell at people, sometimes people who weren't even in the room. Then he treated my mother like she was trash. It's been like that since Derek got home. This was around the time he was diagnosed with diabetes, right? I guess so. He didn't like to talk about it. He hated to think he was less than perfect. Then again, it didn't stop him from thinking he could do things he shouldn't. What do you mean by that? Catalina stopped at the foot of the stairs, twisting the hem of her shirt between her fingers. He would... Never mind. Forget it. No, it's clearly weighing on you. Please, I'm here to listen. I promise I'm really good at it. Catalina glanced around her as if to make sure no one would hear her. A few times, he made some comments to me that weren't really appropriate. Sexual comments. My mother and Mary heard them, and they both got upset. Then, one time, he tried to grab me. I never told Derek. Please, you can't tell him that. So that's not what he and Warren were arguing about last night? No. Derek's been having a rough time with adjusting back to civilian life, and Warren thought it was an act. Like he thought because he'd gone off to war, he had to act wounded. I'm sorry you had to endure that. It sounds horrible. For everyone. Please don't tell Derek about the comments, Catalina repeated. I won't. You have my word. Margot wasn't sure where her gut was leading her with this diabetes angle, but it felt like it was the right track. Still, she dropped the topic as they reached the basement door, which sat ajar. When was the last time someone was down here? Margot asked, noting the disturbed line of dust on the ground. Not in months. Margot got in front of the other woman, letting some of her military training take over. She eased the door open more with her left shoulder, letting in some of the dim sunlight slanting through a high window on the far wall. The shaft of light was enough to illuminate Derek, sitting in the middle of the room. He clutched something to his chest and rocked back and forth. Derek, it's Margot. Can you hear me? She called. Derek didn't react. Perhaps he was sleepwalking. He wasn't whimpering or crying anymore, but his eyes appeared glassy and his skin was freezing. As she moved closer, Margot saw he was clutching a shirt tight to his chest. It was a few sizes too big for him. Perhaps one of Warren's shirts. Catalina rushed into the room and threw herself at her husband. He didn't react to the weight of her body against his. He continued clutching the shirt tightly. Derek, honey, it's me. It's Kat. Wake up. She shook him. He didn't react. Instead, he began mumbling under his breath. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Margot needed to intervene, and so she bent down in front of him. She gripped his hands and pulled them away from his chest. For the second time in only a few hours, she said, Private Nesbitt, attention now, soldier. Derek's head swiveled to the sound of Margot's voice. He blinked and looked at his surroundings. He relinquished his hold on the shirt and Margot's hands. What's going on? I think you were sleepwalking. Baby, you're so cold. Catalina pressed a hand to his forehead. The last thing I remember was going to sleep after the police left. You don't remember our conversation this morning? Margot stood to give him space. No. We talked? Margot nodded. You were having flashbacks about Peter. Remember? Derek struggled to his feet, hampered in his effort by Catalina's weight. I think it's coming back to me.
Why do you have one of Uncle Warren's shirts? Catalina pressed.
Derek glanced down at the fabric that was now covering his bare feet. What? I don't remember getting it. I guess I feel bad about arguing with him.
We should get you cleaned up and into some warmer clothes, Catalina added.
I still can't believe he's gone, Derek murmured, still confused. They started up the cold cement steps and made a beeline to the kitchen, where they found Mary pouring coffee grinds into the percolator. She looked like she hadn't slept well. She turned at the footsteps and gave them a tired smile.
I hope I didn't wake you, she said.
No, we were up, Margot answered. She nudged Derek. You should go get cleaned up. He nodded without a word and disappeared from view. Margot peered around, wondering where Rosalinda had gone. The kitchen looked no cleaner or tidier than it had the night before, so she hadn't really done any cleaning in the middle of the night. What was she doing down here then?
I'm not sure what we've got in the fridge, but you're welcome to whatever we have, Mary offered.
Margot started with a cup of coffee once it finished brewing. I think the storm has stopped. If it's all right with you, I'll dig myself out and head home.
We'd be happy to help, Mary said.
Before Margot could respond, her phone rang from inside her pocket. She yanked it free and saw an unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. Excuse me. She stepped into the foyer before answering.
Hello? Margot, it's Sam,
her cousin said from the other end. She sounded about as awake as Margot felt. Oh, morning. She sipped from the cup in her hand.
Are you still at the Nesbitt house?
Until I can dig my car out. Why?
Can you stick around for a while?
What's going on? Sam let out an exaggerated sigh.
We got preliminary results back. Warren's insulin levels were off the charts.
He was diabetic and used injectable insulin for treatment. That made sense, didn't it? Then again, Sam wouldn't be calling if it were a usual circumstance.
When I say off the charts, I mean he was overdosing on the stuff.
Are you sure? It was still a new disease for him. Maybe he was trying to get the hang of the dosage.
Maybe, but the ME said that the levels looked like they were from prolonged dosing.
That's concerning.
Exactly.
What can I do?
Just keep folks calm. I don't know, give them spiritual guidance or help planning the funeral.
That feels disingenuous.
Just do what they expect of you, given your profession.
Margot wasn't comfortable deceiving the Nesbitts just to keep them occupied while Sam conducted her investigation. But she also couldn't deny that she wanted to dig deeper into the circumstances surrounding Warren's death. If she had to assign motive to anyone, she worried Derek was a likely suspect. He clearly had issues with his uncle's reaction to his time overseas. Still, if Warren had been receiving higher doses of insulin for a long time, Derek couldn't have been the one responsible. The timeline didn't add up. Rosalinda and Catalina also had motive to want to put him in his place, given his horrid treatment of them. But did they have access to the medication, or did he inject himself? And why had Mary failed to mention Warren's diagnosis to Sam? Margot needed an opportunity to look around the rest of the house, while also keeping the family occupied. So she would just have to agree to Sam's terms. Fine, I'll see if I can keep them occupied. Are you coming back over?
Yes, with another forensics team. Now that we know he had diabetes, we need to investigate the angle.
Margot ended the call, hoping no one else had heard her conversation. She tried to run over her responses to Sam's questions in her mind. Without the benefit of the context of Sam's statements, her answers didn't seem too out of the ordinary or obvious. When she returned to the kitchen, she found that Rosalinda had joined them and stood over the stove cooking French toast and pancakes.
What would we do without Rosa? Mary said with a heavy sigh.
If you don't mind, Margot said, do you think I could use the bathroom and take a quick shower?
Of course. We'll save you breakfast.
And I wanted to let you know if you need help with making arrangements for the funeral, I'm here to support you. Whatever you need." She waited to see if Mary would dismiss her offer in the same way she had the day before. Mary gave Derek an approving glance. "You were right about her. She will be perfect to lead the church." Margot didn't respond to Mary's statement, using the distraction to backtrack up to the second floor. She moved down the hall to the bathroom and turned on the shower, feeling guilty for wasting the hot water. She then made her way down to the other end of the hall and into the master bedroom. She took in the large room with the heavy drapes and the thick covers in deep burgundy. It was an inviting space. She moved through the room, stopping first at the bedside table on the right. It bore a small mirror and reading light. She suspected this was Mary's side of the bed. Operating under that assumption, she moved to the other side of the bed and eased the drawer to the matching nightstand open, using the sleeve of her shirt to ensure she didn't leave any prints. Margot expected to find syringes and vials of insulin in the drawer. It was empty. Not even a comb or cell phone charger. Where were they kept? She moved back to Mary's side and pulled open the drawer. The syringes and insulin sat in neat rows. The syringes were blocked after a certain point, ensuring the needles would dispense the same amount of medication. She picked up the insulin bottle to compare the dosage to the syringe depth. As Sam had noted, the syringes were set to administer twice the recommended dose. Why would Mary be giving him twice as much as prescribed? "What is going on?" she whispered to herself. "Can I help you find something?" Mary asked from the doorway. Margot let out a gasp of surprise. Quickly, she returned the vial to the drawer and closed it before turning back to face her hostess. "You scared me. I thought you were taking a shower." "Yes, I was just wondering if there was any body wash." "Not in the bedroom. I'll show you." Margot's heart didn't stop racing until Mary had left her alone in the bathroom, the mirror above the sink thick with steam. Margot shed her clothing and stepped beneath the warm water. The shower had been a pretense to snoop around the house, but she could still use one. It gave her time to ponder why Mary would purposely overdose her husband's medication. Chapter 7. True to their word, the others had saved some breakfast for Margot. A plate of pancakes and French toast sat on the kitchen counter with a small container of maple syrup beside it. She picked up the plate and made her way into the dining room. Derek was the only one remaining from the group. "Where's everyone else?" Margot asked. "They went out to shovel. They figured you would want to get out of here." Margot was a little surprised, because Derek, who was always first to offer to do the chores everyone else complained about, had let others take up shovels. But he'd had a rough night. The dark circles under his eyes were even more pronounced, accenting the bruise. He was still in his pajamas. She could at least spare him the embarrassment of the police searching his home while he was indisposed. "You should get dressed," she said. "I'll keep you company while you eat." "Really, it's fine." His eyes narrowed. They'd spent enough time together that he knew when she wasn't telling him something. "What is it? What aren't you telling me?" "The police need to come back and look at some more things. It would be better if you weren't in your pajamas when they arrive." "How do you know they're coming back?" "Officer Raymond called me. I think she still wants me here with everyone else, in case she has any more questions for all of us." Like why Mary was the one dispensing Warren's insulin, or what had caused those flakes around his mouth and the sweaty sheen on his body. "Right. Of course she called you. I forgot you're related, aren't you?" "That doesn't mean she'll do a less than professional job. I know my cousin. She's meticulous, but fair. If something out of the ordinary happened to your uncle, she will figure it out." "I have a bad feeling about all of this. I mean, I know I was gone for a while, but I can't wrap my head around why he acted so different toward everyone." It was a good question, one to which she planned on finding an answer. "I can eat by myself. You really should go get cleaned up before they arrive." He nodded and traipsed out of the dining room. This left Margot with a little time to snoop. She pulled up a search browser on her cell phone and typed in insulin overdose symptoms. Over 2 million hits populated, but the top result was enough for her. The symptoms described fit the change in Warren's personality. Catalina had noted Warren had become confused at first, and then irritable and anxious. Perhaps even the sweaty sheen resulted from the increased insulin being processed by his body. It still didn't explain why Mary would have doubled the dose. Did she intend to harm her husband? Margot took a few bites of the French toast, but it had gone cold, taking on an odd flavor. Perhaps the syrup had congealed too much. The front door scraped open, and she could hear voices echoing in the foyer. "I don't understand why you have to come back," Mary argued. "Mrs. Nesbit, your husband died under unusual circumstances. I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't investigate. Now, please, let's go inside so we can talk." "No, I didn't ask for the police to be involved." Margot abandoned the plate and entered the kitchen to see a flushed Mary Nesbit bundled in a parka and snow boots. Catalina and Rosalinda weren't with them. Mary and Sam blocked the doorway and Margot's view out into the driveway. "Is everything all right?" Margot tried to diffuse the situation. The bigger audience changed Mary's demeanor. She lowered her voice and put on a smile. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to shout. It's just such a trying time. I feel like she isn't allowing our family the space to grieve our loss." Mary was good, Margot would give her that. She could turn on a dime and play the bereaved widow well. Margot needed to pass on the information she'd gleaned to Sam without giving herself away. As it stood, Margot wasn't sure Mary didn't already know she was snooping and had found the stash of syringes. Had Mary already moved them or disposed of them entirely? "I'm sure Officer Raymond is aware of the painful time your family finds themselves in," Margot said, eyeing her cousin. "I am," Sam agreed. "Mrs. Nesbit, I know this is an intrusion, but we're just following up on a few things. It won't take much time." Sam motioned to someone behind Mary, and a pair of jumpsuit-clad forensic technicians trudged into the house. They were polite enough to kick off the snow from their boots before heading deeper into the house. One technician moved into the kitchen and bent beneath the sink, rummaging through bottles, stuffing them at random into a clear plastic bag. "Why are you taking those?" This time it was Rosalinda who was being argumentative. "We can't disclose that at this time," Sam answered. "And where did that other one go?" Mary questioned. Margot assumed he'd gone up to the second floor in search of the medication. She needed to let Sam know what she'd found, but out of nowhere, her head spun, and the world flashed in and out of focus. Heat raced up her body from her toes, and her vision grayed out, sending panicked signals to her brain. "Oh, God, what's happening?" "Sam, can I talk to you for a moment?" Margot thought her words were clear. She couldn't be certain, though, because they didn't resound in her ears. She grabbed for the counter, but couldn't see anything. She didn't get a verbal response. Instead, when the world righted itself, she was sitting in the dining room, in the chair that Derek had vacated. Sam knelt beside her with worry lines furrowing her forehead. "You okay?" "I'm sorry," Margot said. "I don't know what came over me. One minute I was fine, and then suddenly I felt so dizzy and my vision blacked out. Just sit and take deep breaths." Margot shook her head. "You need to know something." "Whatever it is can wait. I want to make sure you're okay." "No, listen to me. You were right. Warren was being given excessive doses of insulin." She leaned in close for fear of being overheard. Mary was doing it. "I saw the syringes and the vials in her bedside table." Sam worried her lower lip. "You shouldn't have been snooping like that, Margot. You could have gotten hurt." Margot wasn't sure if Mary had tried to sideline her with breakfast. She'd had plenty of opportunity to drug the food while Margot showered. But the dizziness didn't seem to correlate with an isolated incidence of increased insulin. And would it even have the same effect if she ingested it? Sam reached for a radio on her belt and held it to her mouth. "Ben, check the master bedroom." She paused, eyeing Margot for more information. "It should be on the right-hand side when you enter the room." "Right-hand side."
"Copy that,"
Ben's voice crackled through the radio. Margot looked up when someone set a glass of water in front of her. A slight panic spiked her heart rate, but she relaxed a fraction when she saw Catalina.
"Here, you look like you could use it."
Margot gave a weak smile and took a small sip from the glass. Nothing tasted off, and she took the chance, downing it in 2 big swallows.
"If you'll excuse me," Catalina said, "I should see where Derek went. He'll want to know what's going on."
Margot doubted he was unaware of the intruders disassembling his home, but neither Margot nor Sam stopped her. Margot turned back to Sam. "What are they looking for in the kitchen?"
"I can't tell you, Margot. You know that."
Margot cocked her head to one side. "I'm not asking for anything specific. I'm just curious. And I helped you out with the insulin. You shouldn't have told me about that either."
"You're right. I shouldn't have."
"But you did. Whether you like it or not, we're both invested in this. You want to find out the truth for your professional reputation. I want to ensure that this family gets the healing it needs. And I can't help them if I don't know what they need healing from." Sam let out a huff.
"Fine. The ME found unusual chemicals in his blood work."
Would it explain the flakes around his mouth and the sheen on his skin when he died?
"You saw that?"
Margot gave her cousin a knowing look. "I may be a servant of God, but the Lord gave me eyes to see. Besides, I can be rather observant when I want to be."
"Look, I'm sorry you got caught up in this mess," Sam said.
"It isn't anything you did. I accepted the dinner invitation. None of us expected it would end in the death of one of Port Marie's wealthier pillars of the community." "Officer Raymond, there's nothing here," Ben's voice echoed over the radio still clutched in Sam's hand. "She must have gotten rid of it after I found it," Margot muttered.
"Sounds like I better have another little chat with Mrs. Nesbit," Sam said with a resigned expression.
Margot waved her cousin onward. "Go, I'll be fine." She wanted to believe Mary hadn't deliberately poisoned her husband, but Mary's behavior didn't project innocence. Feeling her strength return, Margot got to her feet and made a loop through the back of the house, coming around to the foyer just as Sam cornered Mary in the kitchen. Rosalinda, Derek, and Catalina were gone. A sense of foreboding wrapped around Margot's shoulders like a cloak. There was something she was missing in all of this. It was staring her right in the face, but she couldn't see it. Chapter 8. Margot should have known it would all come back to the monstrous wild cats guarding the entryway to the second floor. She hadn't asked about them, but she should have questioned why they were there and where they came from. Derek marched down the staircase alone and spotted Margot staring up at the lioness. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I never asked. Where did these come from? They don't seem like the sort of thing your uncle would display. I mean, I would have thought him to be against poaching. To be honest, I think his father killed them on a safari or something decades ago. The house belonged to him. Uncle Warren inherited it when he died. It was just too much work to get rid of them." "Don't they creep you out a little?" Derek laughed, the first happy sound she'd heard in 2 days. "When I was a little kid, I was always afraid they would come to life and eat me. I guess after a while, you almost forget they're even here." She understood his childhood fear. Margot stepped up closer to the lioness. "They're kept in pristine condition." "Oh, yeah. The one thing Uncle Warren insisted upon was that they always look their best." "How would he do that?" "Oh, Uncle Warren did nothing. He delegated the task to other people." She ran her finger along the lioness's muzzle. Her finger came away greasy, with that same odd sheen Warren's body had taken on. Little flakes caught up in the air currents dusted her palm. They were just like the flakes around Warren's mouth. That explained why the forensic team collected chemicals from the kitchen. Another piece of the puzzle took shape in Margot's mind, but it only complicated the narrative she'd been constructing. She still didn't know why Mary would overdose her husband on insulin. Perhaps, though, whoever was made to clean the lions had a reason to poison Warren, too. Who cleaned them? Rosalinda. Why? No reason. Not one I can share with you, at least not yet. She didn't want to deceive him, but she wasn't ready to add more pain to what he already carried. "What exactly are you accusing me of, officer?" Mary's voice boomed throughout the first floor. "I'm not accusing you of anything, Mrs. Nesbit. I asked you a simple question. Did your husband administer his own medication?" Derek cleared his throat. "I should go see to that." Margot didn't stop him. She had other things on her mind, like how someone might know the cleaner used on the lions could be harmful to humans. She made her way to the library, the book she'd examined the day before flashing in her mind. The space seemed cavernous when she entered it this time. The shelves still housed immaculately kept volumes, except there was an obvious gap in the taxidermy section. The book she'd examined was missing. Margot guessed the shelf was about shoulder height for both Rosalinda and her daughter. Just because Rosalinda was responsible for cleaning the lions didn't mean someone else in the house couldn't have gotten their hands on the chemicals and used them against Warren. By all accounts, he'd turned his anger toward both Catalina and her mother. Derek had access too, but Margot refused to believe the man with whom she'd shared a tragic bond would frame his mother-in-law. If Catalina was to be believed, he didn't know about Warren's sexual advances toward his new wife. That still left two suspects. "You aren't taking my aunt anywhere," Derek's voice rang out. Margot abandoned her book search and returned to the kitchen. Sam placed handcuffs around Mary's wrists. "She didn't do anything," Derek continued to protest. "If she would tell us where the insulin syringes are, we wouldn't have to do this," Sam answered. Derek's eyes widened as he looked at his aunt. "Tell them where they are, Aunt Mary. Just tell them." Mary shook her head. "I can't." "Just tell them," he begged, his voice skyrocketing into falsetto. "Mary," Margot said in a calm tone. She hoped it would have the effect of bringing everyone's emotions down to a more reasonable level. "I don't think you meant to hurt Warren. Please, just tell Officer Raymond what you know. The truth is always better." Tears sparkled in Mary's eyes as she looked at her nephew. "You left us. We'd given you so much, and you left us. It broke our hearts." "I served my country, something he never appreciated." Anger lowered Derek's tone to a bass. "After a while, we adjusted," Mary said. "We still had Rosalinda and Catalina, but it wasn't the same. And then he got sick with the diabetes. I thought I could at least take care of him, but he insisted he could do it himself. I wanted him to need me. I wanted someone to need me."
"So you gave him more insulin than he needed?"
Sam prompted. "He had trouble getting the right amount to begin with. I begged him to let me draw it for him. He could inject himself. So he let me." "Were you aware that his change in behavior and personality were because of the increased dosage you were giving him?" Margot's tone was soft, non-accusatory. "No, I didn't know." "You're the reason he became such a miserable excuse for a man?" Derek growled. "I wanted him to need me," she repeated, tears staining her cheeks. "Mary Ellen Nesbit, you are under arrest for the murder of Warren Nesbit. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney.
If you cannot afford one, one will be provided to you. Do you understand these rights as I have read them to you?" Sam said.
"Yes," Mary mumbled, before Sam led her out of the house, leaving Margot and Derek to watch in silence. Chapter 9. The gravity of Mary's actions settled over the space, sending Derek collapsing to his knees. Hoping to comfort him, Margot took a step toward him, but he recoiled before she even made contact. "I'm so sorry," she said, keeping her distance. "I should have known something was wrong," he mumbled. "You were gone. You couldn't have known." He looked around the kitchen. She didn't know what he hoped to find. Silence fell again between them, and Margot waited. There was still something that made no sense. What about the chemicals? Had it been a misdirection, or was there something else amiss in all of this? "I have to tell Catalina," Derek announced. Bringing up the chemicals seemed like a cruel thing to do to her friend. He'd just lost both parental figures in his life in the span of a day. But if Mary's actions hadn't been the only factor in Warren's death, shouldn't he know the truth? Shouldn't they all know the truth? "How can I help?" Margot asked. Keeping the chemical knowledge to herself until she had definite answers seemed safer. I don't know. I said so many horrible things to him. I thought he'd just become a crotchety old man in my absence. But it was out of his control. It was all her doing." "You have every right to be angry with her," Margot said. He looked at her, and anger flushed his cheeks. "Is this where you tell me to forgive her because that's what God would want me to do?" "Listen, someday, yes, if you can find it in your heart to forgive her, you should. But it is human nature to harbor anger. We aren't perfect. That's sort of the point. We have flaws, and we make mistakes. Now, I can't speak for your aunt, but it seemed like she acted out of a need that wasn't being fulfilled in her marriage. That isn't on you. I'll be the laughingstock of the town. Maybe it's better if Kat and I go away for good after our honeymoon." "Go where?" "We're taking a honeymoon to the Bahamas, and we're leaving soon. We already have the boarding passes. Just to get away. Be in the sun and sand for a while, and then we'd come back. But after this, I don't think I can show my face around here. Everyone knows our family. They respected us and looked up to us." "And they listened when you touted the abilities of a lowly army chaplain," she reminded him. His anger ebbed a little. "If they've got half a brain, they'll listen. You deserve to have your own congregation, and this town is lacking in younger leadership." "I appreciate your vote of confidence. I do. And if you feel you need a fresh start after all that's happened, I would understand. But don't disappear forever, okay? You aren't the only one who needs a friendly ear from time to time." "I won't ghost you, Chaplain," he said with a fleeting smile. "Come on, let's find your wife and mother-in-law and break the news." Derek refused her help as he got to his feet. They checked the entire first floor, but the other two women were nowhere to be found. They tried upstairs and found them sitting in Catalina's bedroom. Margot spotted the boarding passes sitting in an envelope on the dresser. Did the police find the tickets and jump to the wrong conclusion? "What's going on? Have the police left?" Catalina asked. Margot placed a comforting hand on Derek's shoulder, urging him to break the news. He cleared his throat a few times, then said, "They arrested Aunt Mary." "What? Why? That's ridiculous. She wouldn't have done anything," Catalina protested. Derek hung his head. She was giving him too much insulin. He was overdosing on the stuff. The police think that's why he was acting so irritably and everything. She made him like this. "Why would she do that?" Rosalinda's voice was timid. "We can't speak to her motives. Although, from what she said to Officer Raymond when they took her into custody, she was trying to fill her own need to be needed," Margot answered, keeping Derek from having to explain. I can't believe I never noticed anything, Catalina murmured, sinking back on the bed. Derek joined her and wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. None of us did. I think maybe after we take our honeymoon, we should think about moving. Awkward silence fell over the group of four. Margot knew she should leave them to their private conversation, but her instincts kept her there. But Port Marie is our home, Catalina argued. It used to be, but after this, how can we face everyone? We didn't do anything wrong, but that doesn't mean they won't still talk about us. You know the people here. They love to gossip and spread conspiracy theories. He wasn't wrong. Port Marie wasn't immune to idle gossip, and the town had its share of skeletons in its collective closet. Catalina glanced at her mother, who remained quiet and contemplative. Mummy, you'd come with us, right? Rosalinda looked up, startled by her daughter's question. Yes, mija. She looked around the room. Why would I stay here? I am not needed anymore. It was Margot's turn to clear her throat. I'll leave you all for now. You have my number. Please call if you need anything. Help with the funeral or just someone to lean on. I want you to know I'm here for you. Derek offered his hand. Thank you. I know you didn't sign up for any of this when you came for dinner. Sometimes we don't know where we're needed until we find ourselves there. She headed downstairs, donned her coat, and braved the wintry landscape outside. It appeared Catalina and Rosalinda had dug out her car and had even cleaned it off. Margot climbed in and started the engine, cranking the heater to full blast. She stayed put until a steady stream of warm air caressed her face and fogged the interior of the windshield. Margot wasn't sure where to go now. She had no way to prove whether the cleaning chemicals had been in Warren's system. Sam wouldn't be thrilled to see her, especially if Margot intended to poke holes in the neatly wrapped-up case. She also knew her cousin would want the truth and see justice done, even if that meant the case took an unexpected twist. Chapter 10. I'm sorry, Officer Raymond is off duty. You can speak to one of our other officers, the dispatcher said at the front desk. His nameplate read Officer Weiss, so Margot said, I'm sorry to have bothered you, Officer Weiss, but this is an issue that I need to discuss with Officer Raymond. It concerns a case she's investigating. The older man eyed her warily. I'll see if I can get a hold of her, but she might not answer. She takes her time off seriously. I don't doubt it. If you could just tell her that Margot is asking for her, and it's related to the case. Care to be more specific? He asked. She'll know what I'm referencing. If this officer wasn't aware of Mary Ellen Nesbit being brought in for killing her husband, Margot wouldn't feed into the rumor mill. Take a seat over there. I'll let you know if I can get a hold of her. Thank you so much for your help. Margot took a seat in one of the hard-backed plastic chairs in the waiting area. The military had trained her to put up with a whole host of situations. Waiting in a small police precinct was nothing compared to most of them. Besides, it would give her a chance to people-watch. It was a hobby she'd developed while serving overseas. She could learn a lot about a person just by watching them in their environment. Yeah, Officer Raymond, I'm sorry to disturb you during your day off, but I've got a Margot here. She says she needs to talk to you about a case you're working. She wouldn't say which case. I can tell her to come back another... He held the receiver to his shoulder, blocking the speaker with one hand. Ma'am, she's asking to speak with you directly. Thank you. Margot stood and accepted the phone. Hi, Sam. What is it? Margot turned her back to the dispatcher. It would be better if we could meet in person to discuss this. I'm not sure what there is to discuss. Case is closed. I think you're wrong. Or at least, you're missing something. I don't tell you how to minister to people. Don't tell me how to do police work. Got it? Her cousin's tone stung. I'm not trying to.
But there's a piece of this you haven't fully considered. You want to make sure everything you have is accurate, don't you? Fine, but I'm not coming back in. It's my day off. I can come to you, Margot offered. I'll give you the address. Margot smiled. You haven't moved in 4 years. You haven't even changed your phone number. Oh, right. I'll be right over. She handed the receiver back to Officer Weiss. Thank you. She zipped up her coat and retreated to her car, intent on making one detour before she met up with Sam. Bringing a peace offering wouldn't be a bad thing. She arrived 15 minutes later with a hot coffee for them both. Even a minister of the Lord needed a pick-me-up now and again. And Margot had to admit that the coffee stateside was far superior to the watered-down imitation served on base. When Margot knocked, Sam opened the door dressed in baggy sweatpants and a sweatshirt with Port Marie's police emblem emblazoned on the front. I come bearing gifts. Margot held out one of the travel cups. Sam accepted it and ushered Margot inside. The house looked the same as the last time Margot had been here. She'd helped Sam move in after she rented the place. She had fond memories of the pair of them staying awake until the early hours of the morning, chatting and sharing their plans for their lives. It was surprising how much had gone to plan for them both, and what hadn't. Margot had always assumed her cousin would settle down and marry long before Margot did. Yet they were both still single. This place hasn't changed, Margot said, as they moved into the living room with its inviting stucco fireplace and love seat. Well, I own the place outright now. Margot's jaw dropped. You bought it? When? Sam shrugged one shoulder. A year ago. But you didn't come over to talk about the fact I'm a homeowner now. No, I didn't. Margot set her coffee on the coffee table in front of the love seat. I know you were looking at the cleaning chemicals at the house, and you wouldn't tell me why. I can't discuss parts of my investigation with a civilian. You get that, right? I do, but I can't shake this feeling that there's something to it. Look, we have the killer. She confessed, and we know how she did it. Did the medical examiner tell you definitively that it was just an insulin overdose? I mean, would that even be enough to kill someone? We're still waiting on a more detailed report. What are you getting at? Said Sam, starting to get irritated. Time to put all of her cards on the table and hope Sam took the leap of faith with her. We both know about the flakes on his body, and I don't know, but this morning when I was eating, I felt sick, like maybe someone put something in the food. How are either of those things connected? You said there were some odd chemicals in his blood. I noticed the same flakes on the lions by the entryway. Derek told me that Rosalinda cleans them. She's the only one. Plus, there was a book in the library on taxidermy that went missing. So, what, you think Mary knew that and used it too? Why would she do that? I don't know why Mary would do that. She knew Rosalinda had at least one reason motivating her. Maybe Margot could get the other woman to confess before she brought Sam into it. You know what? I think I'm letting this all get to me. You're right. I'm not the investigator here. I'll stay in my lane. Enjoy the coffee. Margot retrieved her cup and was halfway to the front door before Sam called out to her. I'm sorry we had to reconnect like this, but I'm glad we did. I hope you know that. Margot turned and gave her cousin a smile. I'm glad too. I've missed you. Now, if she could secure the final piece of this puzzle, maybe things would feel right again. Chapter 11. Margot wasn't sure where she would find the answer she was looking for, so she let God lead her, and she ended up at the church. It was her first time at the church since she'd been home. God had led her to the right place, because she could use the quiet to reflect on the situation. The emptiness would also afford her a chance to explore the other areas added onto the original church building when the town had deemed it an interfaith space. She wandered from the narthex to the prayer room. A handful of prayer rugs were laid out, ready for use.
A stack of others sat piled high off to one side. The mid-afternoon sunlight dappled the wooden floor through a high window. She'd known a few soldiers who practiced Islam, and she had always found their time for prayer soothing. She hadn't been able to learn all of the prayers, but she'd committed to learning enough to share in their worship. Next, she made her way to the East Hall that now served as the synagogue. It appeared empty. Only a few chairs scattered through the space signaled that anyone had been inside in a while. She could see a fine coating of dust covering the space. Perhaps they'd used the sanctuary instead. It was a far more inviting atmosphere. She wound her way back to that part of the church, expecting it to still be vacant. A lone figure sat up at the front near the pulpit. From this distance, Margot couldn't discern their identity. She wanted to give whoever it was their privacy. The sound of her footsteps on the creaky stairs leading in from the narthex drew the other occupants' attention. When the person turned, Margot recognized Rosalinda's dark eyes and graying temples, but she appeared pale, even with her cinnamon-colored skin. "I didn't mean to disturb you," Margot said. "It is okay." Rosalinda continued to gaze back at Margot, almost inviting her to close the distance and join her. "Do you mind if I join you?" Rosalinda shook her head and patted the pew beside her. Margot started down the center aisle, taking her time, formulating a way she could broach the subject without appearing accusatory. "It's been a long few days, hasn't it?" Margot said when she was settled in beside the older woman. "Yes." Rosalinda opened her mouth to say more, but stopped. "I'm so sorry that you're out of a job," Margot said. Rosalinda fiddled with a few strands of loose hair. "I do not know that it matters." "Why would you say that?" Margot asked, as gently as possible. Rosalinda kneaded her hands together, not making eye contact. Instead, she turned her attention to the pulpit and the image of Christ on the cross. If she needed to make her confession to Christ, so be it. In a voice so quiet it sounded like a sigh, she whispered, "I did something. I'm here to listen." Margot didn't want to lull the woman into a false sense of safety, but she was there to listen to whatever had prompted Rosalinda's change of heart. "When Derek told us what Mary did, it made me angry." "Angry? Because you had no job?" Rosalinda shook her head. "Angry because I did something I can't take back." "What did you do?" "Mr. Nesbit was always particular. He told me to clean the lions every day." Anger clouded her facial features, and her lips pursed. "He had given me so much that I put up with it. But then he became mean. He said I would do it wrong. It made him angry. He even hit me a few times." "I'm so sorry that happened. He had no right to do that." She sighed. "It was because of what Mary did to him. If she let him be, he would not have become so angry and hateful. He would not have tried to hurt me or my daughter while her husband was away." She turned to look at Margot. "You know he said things no man should say to a woman who is engaged." Margot nodded. Rosalinda danced around the actual truth of what she'd done. As awful as her actions were, Margot grew frustrated with the runaround. "If there's something else you want to tell me, you know you can." "You will tell the police lady?" "There is a clergy congregant privilege, which means our conversation is confidential. But I think you would feel better if you came clean." "I mixed some of the cleaner with his drinks. I read it could be harmful. I did not mean to kill him. I only wanted to make him stop. I did not know it would do that." Margot wanted to believe her statement. The sadness that now showed on the woman's face and the unshed tears in her eyes showed it was the truth. Just like Mary, She hadn't meant to kill him. It was likely a combination of the insulin overdose and the cleaner that were the true culprits. You had no idea that Mary was poisoning him too? No, I did not know what she did. I swear to God. And she didn't know what you were doing, Margot muttered, mostly to herself. I do not think so. No. Margot let out a long breath and turned to face the image of Christ. She'd found out the truth about Warren's death. It hadn't been intentional on either of the women's part, and they hadn't acted together. There was no conspiracy. With enough time, the medical examiner could determine how much each woman contributed to Warren's demise. What that would mean for their futures was still up in the air. I won't tell the police what you've told me here today, but again, I think you would feel better if you told them what happened. I will go to jail. Possibly. I can't say for certain that will happen. I don't think anyone can. You did what you did to protect yourself and your daughter, which is an admirable thing. You went about it the wrong way, but I'm sure they will take that into consideration. I'll go with you to the police station if you want, and I can also go with you when you tell Catalina the truth. This will break my Catalina's heart. I can't tell her. You can't just vanish from her life. She needs to know the truth, so she and Derek can begin the process of healing. Please, don't keep this burden on yourself. I am scared. I know, but you aren't alone in this. I promise. I'll go with you. She nodded and reached out for Margot's hand. Rosalinda faltered as she stood. Margot caught her, letting the older woman place her weight more fully on Margot's shoulders. They took their time walking out of the church and to Margot's car. The ride back to the Nesbit house was silent, but Margot didn't mind. She let Rosalinda build up the courage to come clean to her daughter and son-in-law. Margot knocked on the front door, feeling it better to announce their presence, given the news they were about to impart. "Mummy, why are you knocking?" Catalina asked upon answering the door. "I need to talk to you, mija. Is Derek here?" "He's down in the basement. He's been going through Warren's things." "Why?" "You should get him," Margot said. Catalina remained in the doorway, color draining from her face. "What is going on? Just tell me." "It's better if we come inside. Please," Margot prodded. "Mummy?" Catalina asked. "Listen to her," Rosalinda replied. Catalina stepped back and let them inside. Margot held tight to Rosalinda's hand as they made their way into the library. "I'll get Derek," Catalina said, her tone flat. Margot supposed she was preparing for the worst. Had she put two and two together about the fact the forensic team was looking at cleaning supplies? Derek and Catalina returned a few moments later. He looked tired and grimy, but attentive. Catalina was still pale, and she held tight to her husband's hand. "You're back, Chaplain," Derek said. "What's going on?" "Rosalinda needs to share something with you both," Margot replied, squeezing Rosalinda's hand tight. "I can't come with you when you go away," Rosalinda began. "Of course you can. We aren't going to just leave you here. You don't have to worry about that. Our trip is only for 10 days. We'll be back before you know it," Catalina argued. "No, mija. I won't be going with you because I have to stay here." "I don't understand. Why?" Derek asked. Rosalinda's tears fell, carving tracks along her cheeks. "Because I have to go to the police station. I did something bad to Mr. Nesbit. I have to tell them what I did." Derek frowned. "You didn't do anything, Rosa. Aunt Mary hurt him. She's the reason he's dead." "No, I hurt him too. He treated me so bad, I got angry. I wanted him to stop, so I tried to make him sick. I never meant to kill him. I don't think I would have killed him on my own, not even as an accident. Maybe we both did it without meaning to, but I can't live with it. I have to tell the truth." "You can't do that! You'll go to jail! I won't let you!" Catalina erupted. "It isn't up to you," Margot said in a gentle voice. "Rosalinda decided to confess to the police, to take responsibility for her part in what happened. She's going to do the honorable thing." "Why would you do that? Why wouldn't you tell me?" Catalina broke down, tears marring her cheeks too. "I was trying to protect you, to protect us both. It is what a parent does for a child. I will bear this burden on my own shoulders. You will live your life. You two have so much ahead of you. I can't do this without you, Mummy." Derek remained quiet, and Margot watched him, trying to gauge his reaction. He'd already suffered a blow by finding out his aunt, his mother figure, had been the reason he'd lost his father figure, no matter how difficult their relationship had become. Now he had to be a rock for his wife, who was suffering the same blow. It was a horrible situation, and she was at a loss for how to make it better. "Rosalinda, if you want me to go to the station with you, I'll do that," Margot offered again. Rosalinda shook her head. "Thank you. You have been very kind to us these last few days, when you did not have to be." She looked to her daughter and son-in-law. "Lean on each other. Lean on her, even if you do not make this place your home anymore. You have someone here who will understand your loss and your pain, and will not judge you for your anger." "I am really sorry for everything that's happened," Margot whispered, before leaving them to sort out their own affairs. Chapter 12. A month had passed since Warren Nesbitt's death. A well-attended service was held at the church, and a judge allowed both Rosalinda and Mary to attend. Their children had been good enough to put on a show of a united, though grieving, front during the service. Privately, Margot knew, they were hurting and angry. Sam let Margot know that the medical examiner determined a lethal combination of the insulin and the cleaner had stopped Warren's heart. It wasn't possible to tell which woman was more at fault, and they'd both agreed to private plea deals. They would each serve reduced sentences. Rumors swirled about the circumstances of Warren's passing, and the fact that the Nesbitt home was now for sale. Derek and Catalina were moving to Maine, and had placed a down payment on a small house. "You look ready," Reverend Holly said from behind Margot. She turned to look at him, and smiled. Today was her first day as the new minister of Port Marie's Interfaith Church. She'd let Derek's praise fuel the congregation into calling her to serve them, and she'd found a welcoming sea of faces when she stood at the pulpit. She'd spent a long time preparing for this week's sermon. It seemed she'd found her purpose after all. "I hope so. It's been a while since I've had to prepare a sermon." She smoothed the vestments around her neck. "You're going to do fine. You've been preparing for this for a very long time. The people out there are waiting for you to share your wisdom." "I'm glad you're here. I'm not sure I could get through today without seeing your face in the congregation." "Just focus on me if it helps." "It will. Thank you." He patted her on the arm and left her to gather her notes. She studied the points she wanted to highlight. The community needed to remember that even when Daniel entered the lion's den, God looked out for him and brought him out of danger unharmed. Port Marie would come through this trying time stronger. So would Derek and Catalina. Margot took a few steadying breaths before she moved behind the pulpit. Her jaw went slack at the packed house. She spotted a few yarmulkes and hijabs in the crowd. Sitting right in the front row were two faces she hadn't expected to see, Derek and Catalina. Reverend Holly sat 2 rows back and to their left. She didn't need to preach to him when she could speak to the people who needed to hear her message the most. Margot smiled out at the waiting faces and gave the cue to the organist to begin the prelude and first hymn. She liked that they changed up the musical selections to represent different faiths. Everyone returned to their seats, and Margot stepped up to the microphone. "Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad to see so many people here today. You really know how to make a person feel welcome. Port Marie has been my home my entire life, but it wasn't until I went away for a while that I realized just how much it meant to call it home. I am grateful that you and God have called me to serve as your minister. I know that our community suffered a loss, but together we will weather this storm and come out the other side stronger." When she made direct eye contact with Derek, he gave her an encouraging smile. She continued, "Some of you may know that I served as a chaplain in the Army and did a tour of duty overseas. In my time there, we witnessed a lot of strife and struggle. But the story of Daniel and the lion's den reminds us that even in the most perilous of situations, we can come out stronger if we have faith in God's guiding force. I hope we can all remember this important message as we move forward together." Derek gave a small nod of understanding, and her day was complete. She had touched one person, which was her goal in her ministry. Impacting one life can multiply, and she was counting on that feeling spreading. The rest of the service passed in a blur, and before she knew it, Margot stood at the entrance to the fellowship hall, shaking hands and greeting faces, both old and new. She waited, scanning the crowd for Derek and Catalina. They finally made their way to the front of the line. "Good sermon, Reverend," Derek said. "No chaplain?" she teased. "Well, you'll always be chaplain to me, but you're serving a wider congregation than just our unit now." "I have to admit, it surprised me seeing the 2 of you here today. Happy, but surprised." "We wouldn't miss your first sermon," Derek replied. "How are you holding up?" "We're taking it day by day," Catalina replied, holding tight to her husband's arm. "We haven't been to see them," Derek said, without prompting. "Give it time," Margot answered. She eyed the growing line behind them and gave them a sad smile. "Come find me later. I'm happy to chat." "Thanks." They melted into the crowd within the fellowship hall, leaving Margot to greet more congregants. Sam made her way down the stairs and stopped in front of Margot. Margot was about to offer a handshake to her cousin when Sam pulled her into a tight hug. The rest of the people around them gave them space. "What was that for?" Margot asked. "I should have done it a while ago. I know I was territorial with the whole investigation thing, but I don't think I would have gotten the whole truth without you." "You didn't need me. I just pointed out a couple things. You did all the hard work." Sam shook her head. "This was my first homicide," she confided. "I couldn't tell," Margot replied. "Thanks. You know, if you need to talk about anything, even if it's just silly stuff, I'm here." Having Sam back in her life brought Margot a deeper sense of connection to her hometown and her family, a lightness she hadn't felt since before her deployment. "I will take you up on that." Sam looked at the gathered masses. "I hope everyone can take what you said today to heart." With time, everyone will move forward. They won't forget what happened, but they'll learn to forgive. Margot truly believed that her little town would rebound from the loss of one of its more prominent figures. She would settle into her new role and do what she could to help the healing process. She only prayed that such heartbreak wouldn't strike again anytime soon. This has been Into the Lion's Den, a Reverend Margot Quade cozy mystery novella, Book 1. Written by S.E. Biglow. Narrated by Stephanie Dillard. Copyright 2020 by Sarah Biglow.
Production copyright 2020 by Sarah Biglow.